Hello. Tonight we stand at the far edge of the known world. The sea is dark and calm, and a thin mist drifts between islands that do not yet have names. There are no borders here, no capitals, no written laws. Only wind, water, stone, and the quiet patience of time. This is Japan before history was written. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you wish, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For most of human existence, memory did not live on paper. It lived in voices, in gestures, in repeated movements passed from one generation to the next. Ancient Japan begins in that world, a world where stories were carried by breath, not ink, and where the past was something you felt beneath your feet, not something you read. For centuries, what we knew of Japan's beginnings came from myth. From tales of gods stirring the sea with jeweled spears, of islands born from droplets of salt water, of a sun goddess retreating into a cave and plunging the world into darkness. These stories were not meant to be questioned. They explained why the land existed, why order mattered, and why certain families ruled. Myth was memory, and memory was truth. But beneath those stories, the land itself was keeping a quieter record. The Japanese archipelago lies on the edge of continents, stretched like a fragile bridge between worlds. Today it feels isolated, surrounded by water, but it was not always so. Long ago, during colder ages, the sea withdrew, ice locked up the oceans, and land rose where waves now move. Japan was not yet an island nation, it was a frontier. Animals crossed first, then much later, humans followed. They left no names behind, no written prayers, no monuments announcing their arrival. What they left were traces, chipped stone tools buried in soil, charcoal from ancient fires, patterns disturbed in layers of earth. Archaeology listens to these traces patiently, without drama. A blade edge, a hearth circle, a scatter of bones. From these, a different kind of story emerges. This is where legend begins to loosen its grip. The shift from myth to archaeology is not a rejection of the old stories, but a quiet widening of perspective. Myth tells us how people understood their world. Archaeology shows us how they lived in it. One speaks in symbols, the other speaks in evidence. Together, they form the bridge between imagination and reality. In this deep beginning, there is no Japan as a nation. There is only landscape, mountains dense with forest, rivers heavy with fish, coastlines rich with shellfish and drifting wood. Seasons that return faithfully, shaping human movement and thought. People lived without kings, without borders, without the idea that history itself was something that could be recorded. Where does legend end and history begin? There is no clear line. The change is gradual, like dawn spreading across water. First come objects, then patterns, only much later come words. Tonight, we pause in that long twilight, in a time when the land was still becoming familiar to human hands, and humans were still learning how to belong to it. Somewhere ahead, footsteps are already moving, crossing land that no longer exists, carrying life toward these quiet islands, and with them, the first chapter of a very long story is about to begin. Those footsteps belong to the first people of the islands, moving quietly across land that no longer exists, following herds and seasons into what will one day be called Japan. Around 40,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the world was colder and drier. Sea levels were lower, and the Japanese archipelago was not yet fully separated from the Asian mainland. To the north, land bridges connected Hokkaido to Siberia. To the south and west, shallow seas and narrow straits linked the islands to the Korean peninsula. These routes were not roads, only possibilities, paths revealed by climate, then erased again by water. The people who crossed them did not know they were entering a future nation. They were hunter-gatherers, like countless others across Eurasia, carrying knowledge rather than possessions. Their tools were simple but effective, stone blades chipped with care, spear points shaped for hunting deer and wild boar, scrapers for hides and wood. Archaeologists find these tools scattered across Japan from open plains to upland forests, suggesting a wide and flexible use of the land. Life was mobile, guided by food and weather rather than by fixed settlements or borders. Japan's environment shaped these early lives in quiet but decisive ways. Even during colder periods, the islands supported dense forests and abundant rivers. Volcanic soil enriched plant life, and coastlines offered fish, shellfish, and sea mammals. This richness allowed small groups to survive without constant movement. Camps were seasonal, returning to familiar places year after year. Fires were built, abandoned, and built again. Over time, these repeated returns left faint signatures in the earth layers of ash, broken tools, bones discarded after meals. There were no villages yet, no permanent homes built to last generations. Shelters were temporary, made of wood, hides, and earth. Caves and rock overhangs offered protection from wind and snow. Life expectancy was short, and survival required cooperation. Knowledge mattered more than strength alone. Where animals migrated, which plants were edible, how stone fractured best when struck at the right angle. This knowledge was shared orally through demonstration and repetition, binding small groups together. Without writing, identity was immediate and local. There were no recorded ancestors, no dynasties, no sense of a deep national past. Time was measured in cycles, the return of cold, the blooming of plants, the movement of animals. Death left little behind. Burials were simple, often shallow, sometimes indistinguishable from ordinary ground. The dead returned to the landscape that sustained the living. Memory lived in people, not in monuments. One of the most striking features of Paleolithic Japan is how quietly it begins. There is no sudden explosion of culture, no dramatic technological leap that separates these people from those who came before them elsewhere. Instead, there is adaptation. The stone tool traditions found in Japan show both continuity with continental styles and local variation. Obsidian, prized for its sharpness, was transported over long distances, suggesting networks of movement and exchange. Even in this early period, the islands were not isolated in thought or practice. As the climate slowly warmed, the world these people knew began to change. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose. The land bridges that had allowed entry disappeared beneath advancing water. What had been a frontier became an archipelago. For the people already living there, this was not an event marked by ceremony or fear. It was gradual, unfolding over generations. Rivers widened. Coastlines shifted. Paths vanished. The islands closed quietly behind them. Isolation did not mean stagnation. Cut off from the mainland, human communities adapted further to local conditions. Hunting strategies shifted. Fishing became more important. Forest resources were used more intensively. Over time, this relative separation encouraged distinctive ways of living. Japan began to follow its own rhythm, shaped by its environment rather than by constant influx from outside. Still, this is not yet a story of culture in the way later ages will understand it. There are no temples, no art meant to endure, no social hierarchies visible in the ground. Life remains balanced on necessity. People live close to hunger and cold, but also close to abundance when seasons are kind. Their world is immediate, practical, and deeply connected to the land around them. If you could stand beside one of these ancient camps at dusk, you would hear little beyond wind in trees and the crackle of fire. Tools are checked, food is shared, the night arrives without announcement. There is no sense that this moment will be remembered thousands of years later, and yet it will be through stone fragments and soil layers, through the patient work of archaeology that listens where voices are gone. As the climate continues to warm and the seas rise higher, something subtle begins to shift. People stay longer in one place. Camps grow familiar enough to feel almost permanent. New practices emerge, tentative at first, that hint at a different relationship with time and survival. In the quiet spaces between forest and shore, the foundations of a more settled world are beginning to form, waiting for the slow arrival of a life shaped not just by movement, but by staying. by returning to the same shores and forests, often enough that the land itself begins to feel familiar, almost dependable. This is where the world of the Jōmon slowly takes shape. As the Ice Age finally loosens its grip, Japan becomes fully what it is today, an archipelago defined by water. Seas rise and settle into new coastlines, rivers widen and deepen. Forests thicken across hills and valleys, covering much of the land in green. The climate grows warmer and more stable, and with that stability comes a quiet but profound change in human life. People remain. The Jōmon period begins around 14,000 BCE and stretches across thousands of years longer than many later civilizations will last from rise to fall. It is not defined by kings or wars, but by continuity. The word Jōmon itself means cord-marked, named for the distinctive patterns pressed into clay vessels with twisted rope. These pots are among the oldest known pottery in the world, appearing here long before agriculture, cities, or states. This detail matters. Pottery is usually tied to farming and storage, but the Jōmon did not farm rice or wheat. They hunted, fished, gathered nuts, roots, fruits, and shellfish. What they did have was abundance. The forests provided chestnuts and acorns. Rivers and seas offered fish, salmon, shellfish, and seaweed. Game moved through the woods in predictable patterns. With resources available year after year, mobility slowed. Settlements became semi-permanent, then familiar enough to feel like home. Homes were simple pit dwellings, dug slightly into the earth for insulation. Wooden frames supported thatched roofs. Smoke from hearths darkened the interiors, and ash built up slowly over generations. Outside, daily life unfolded close to water and trees. Children learned paths before they learned words. Tools were shaped and reshaped, often from local stone. Life remained intimate and local, but no longer fleeting. The pottery tells part of this story. Jōmon vessels were not purely practical. Many are elaborate, with flared rims and complex designs that would have taken time and care to create. Some were used for cooking, others perhaps for storage or ritual. The effort invested suggests that time itself had changed. There was space in life not only for survival, but for expression. This expression extended beyond pottery. Archaeologists find lacquered objects, woven baskets, carved tools, and ornaments made from bone, shell, and stone. These were not signs of wealth or status in a hierarchical sense. Graves from the period show relatively little difference between individuals. There is no clear evidence of powerful elites or rigid social classes. Instead, the Jōmon world appears broadly egalitarian, organized around small communities bound by shared knowledge and mutual dependence. Ritual, however, was present everywhere. Clay figurines known as dogu appear across Jōmon sites, especially in later phases. They are small, often stylized, sometimes exaggerated in form. Large eyes, broad hips, broken limbs. Their exact purpose remains uncertain. Some may have been used in healing rituals, others perhaps in seasonal ceremonies tied to fertility, birth, or death. Many are found deliberately broken, suggesting that their meaning lay in the act, not the object itself. What is clear is that the Jōmon saw the world as alive, with forces beyond the visible. Forests were not just resources, rivers were not just water, animals were not just prey. Everything existed within a web of relationships that demanded respect. This was not yet Shinto as later ages would define it, but the foundations were there, an attentiveness to place, to spirits associated with natural features, to the idea that harmony mattered. Time moved differently here. Without writing or calendars, memory remained cyclical. Seasons returned, rituals repeated. Ancestors were remembered through place rather than record. Middens, large piles of shells and refuse grew near settlements, marking years of continuous occupation. They were not hidden. They became part of the landscape, layered evidence of life lived slowly. Trade existed, but on a modest scale. Obsidian traveled across long distances between regions, indicating exchange networks that linked distant communities. These networks were not political. They were practical and social, reinforcing connection without domination. Even so, the islands were not uniform. Regional differences emerged in pottery styles, settlement patterns, and ritual practices. Japan was already diverse, even in this deep past. Importantly, this long period unfolded without the development of agriculture as the central organizing force. This sets Jōmon Japan apart from many other ancient societies. While farming appeared elsewhere as a response to population pressure or climate change, here the environment remained rich enough to sustain a foraging lifestyle for millennia. The result was a culture that valued balance over expansion, continuity over accumulation. This does not mean life was easy. Periods of cooling returned, volcanic eruptions reshaped landscapes, resources fluctuated, communities adapted or moved. But there is little evidence of widespread conflict or organized warfare. Weapons existed for hunting, not for armies. Fortifications are rare. The social world remained relatively flat. If you imagine standing near a Jōmon settlement at dawn, the scene is quiet. Mist rises from water, smoke curls upward from hearths. Someone checks fish traps, someone else repairs a pot cracked by fire. There is no sense of hurry. The future does not stretch far ahead. It returns, again and again, with the seasons. Yet change is never absent, only slow. Toward the later Jōmon period, subtle pressures begin to appear. Populations grow in some regions. Climate patterns shift again, becoming cooler and less predictable. Resources that once felt endless require more careful management. Social interactions become more complex. Ritual objects grow more elaborate. Burials show slightly greater variation, hinting at emerging differences in role or status. Still, the core remains. A life shaped by water and forest. A way of being that does not seek to master nature, but to live within it. This legacy will not disappear when new ideas arrive. It will be absorbed, reshaped, carried forward beneath the surface of later transformations. Because across the sea, beyond the horizon, other worlds are changing faster. Farming communities grow, metals are shaped and sharpened, hierarchies harden, and eventually, carried by boats and people, those changes will reach these islands. For now, though, the Jōmon world continues patient, grounded, attentive to land and spirit alike. It does not know that its time will end. It only knows the rhythm of waves on shore, the weight of clay in the hand, and the quiet understanding that survival is not about conquest, but about balance. And somewhere beyond the forests and water that have sustained this life for thousands of years, a new kind of seed is already moving closer, bringing with it a transformation that will root itself deeply into the soil and change everything that follows. This change arrives quietly, carried across narrow stretches of sea, held in the hands of people who already know its power. It is rice. Around the first millennium BCE, long after the Jōmon world has learned how to endure, new influences begin to reach the Japanese islands from the Asian continent, particularly from the Korean peninsula. They do not arrive all at once, and they do not erase what came before. Instead, they settle unevenly, taking root first in the western regions of Kyushu, and gradually spreading eastward. What follows is not a sudden break, but a deep transformation that unfolds over centuries. Rice agriculture changes the relationship between people and land in a fundamental way. Unlike hunting or gathering, wet rice cultivation requires planning, cooperation, and permanence. Fields must be cleared and leveled, irrigation channels must be built and maintained, seeds must be planted at the right time, tended carefully, and harvested together. The work binds communities not just to the land, but to each other and to the future. With rice comes surplus, and with surplus comes storage, ownership, and comparison. This period is known as the Yayoi era, named after a district in modern Tokyo where its distinctive pottery was first identified. Yayoi pottery is plainer than that of the Jōmon, thinner, more functional, designed for daily use rather than ritual display. The shift in style reflects a shift in values. Time is no longer spent elaborating form for its own sake. Labor is redirected toward production. Alongside rice arrive new technologies. Bronze appears first, used for ritual objects such as bells and mirrors. Iron follows, more transformative still. Iron tools make forest clearing faster and more efficient. Iron weapons make conflict deadlier. These materials are not native to Japan. They must be imported or produced using knowledge brought from elsewhere. Their presence signals increasing contact with the wider East Asian world. The social consequences are immediate and lasting. Rice fields cannot be moved easily. Once established, they anchor people in place. Villages become permanent. Land becomes valuable. Those who control water and fields gain influence over those who depend on them. Leadership shifts from informal authority based on skill or age to more formal roles tied to land management and defense. Inequality, faint during the Jōmon period, becomes visible. Archaeology reveals this change in the ground itself. Graves from the Yayoi period vary in size and richness. Some individuals are buried with bronze mirrors, weapons or ornaments. Others are not. Settlements grow larger and more organized, often surrounded by ditches or palisades. These are not symbolic boundaries, they are practical defenses. Conflict enters the record quietly, then unmistakably. Skeletal remains show injuries consistent with violence. Fortified villages appear in regions where competition over fertile land is intense. Rice produces abundance, but it also concentrates risk. Floods, droughts, and pests threaten entire communities at once. Protection becomes as important as production. Yet this transformation does not replace the Jōmon world overnight. For centuries, Jōmon and Yayoi lifeways coexist. In some regions, hunting and gathering remain dominant. In others, mixed economies develop. People intermarry. Beliefs blend. The population itself becomes a fusion of lineages rather than a simple replacement. Modern genetic studies reflect this deep mixture, showing continuity beneath change. Spiritually, the world remains alive with unseen forces. Agricultural rituals emerge, focused on planting and harvest, fertility and protection. Bronze bells known as dotaku are buried in fields or near settlements, possibly used in ceremonies tied to the agricultural cycle. Their sound, when struck, would have carried across fields and water, marking time in a new way. Leadership during the Yayoi period remains local, but power is becoming more defined. Small chiefdoms form, each controlling clusters of villages and fields. Alliances shift, rivalries harden. The idea of territory begins to matter not just as a place lived in, but as something defended and inherited. Contact with the continent continues. Chinese chronicles from later centuries describe the peoples of the Japanese islands as divided into many communities, sometimes at war, sometimes trading. They note differences in customs, tattooing, and ritual behavior. These external observations offer brief glimpses into a world that is still largely undocumented from within. Daily life, however, remains grounded. Farmers rise early. Fields must be flooded, weeded, watched. Harvests are communal efforts. Tools are repaired constantly. Children grow up knowing the boundaries of fields and the rhythm of planting seasons. Hunger still exists, but it is different now, less tied to sudden scarcity, more to failure of systems that have become complex and fragile. The shift to agriculture also changes how time is imagined. The future becomes something that can be prepared for, stored against, planned into. This encourages long-term thinking, but also anxiety. Granaries must be protected, surplus must be guarded. Authority becomes justified not only by tradition, but by the promise of stability. In this way, rice roots more than food into the soil. It roots power. By the later Yayoi period, regional differences sharpen. Some areas develop stronger political centers, others remain fragmented. Weapons become more common in elite burials, social roles specialize. The groundwork for larger political structures is being laid, even if no one yet imagines a unified state. If you stand at the edge of a Yayoi rice field at dusk, the scene feels ordered in a way earlier camps did not. Water reflects the sky, rows stretch evenly across the land. The labor of many hands is visible everywhere. It is calm, but it is no longer simple. Beneath the surface lies dependence on weather, on leadership, on cooperation enforced as much as chosen. The Jōmon world does not vanish. Its respect for nature, its sense of balance, remains woven into daily practice and belief. But it is now joined by something new and irreversible, a society anchored to land, surplus, and hierarchy. And as fields spread and chiefdoms grow stronger, the need arises for something beyond local authority, someone or something that can bind communities together, speak for them beyond the sea, and give order to a world that has become more productive, more unequal, and more dangerous. That need will soon take shape in the figure of a ruler remembered not through legend alone, but through the written words of another civilization watching from afar. This is where ancient Japan steps briefly and partially into recorded history. By the 3rd century CE, the Japanese islands are a mosaic of communities shaped by centuries of rice cultivation, local rule, and shifting alliances. There is still no single state, no capital that commands all others. Instead, power is scattered among dozens, perhaps hundreds of clan leaders. Some control fertile plains. Others command strategic coastlines or river mouths. Each claims authority through ancestry, ritual knowledge, and the ability to protect followers in uncertain times. Chinese dynastic histories call this land War. Their descriptions are fragmentary, filtered through distance and diplomacy, but they provide something new: names, dates, and political observations. For the first time, Japan is not only remembered through objects in the ground, but through words written elsewhere. Among these records, one figure stands apart. Her name is Himiko. According to the Weiji, part of the records of the Three Kingdoms compiled in the 3rd century, Himiko ruled over a polity known as Yamatai. She was not described as a warrior or lawgiver. Instead, she was a shaman-queen, a woman who governed through spiritual authority. She was said to remain unmarried, living secluded within her residence, attended by female servants, while a younger brother handled communication and administration on her behalf. The chroniclers emphasize her role as mediator between worlds. Through ritual and divination, she maintained order in a land troubled by conflict. Before her rise, the records note, the people of Wa were locked in cycles of violence and instability. Under her rule, there was peace. Whether this peace was complete or exaggerated is impossible to know. Chinese historians often framed foreign rulers in ways that made sense within their own worldview. Still, the image is striking. In a time when political authority elsewhere was often male and martial, here is a ruler whose power rests on sacred legitimacy. Yamatai itself remains elusive. Archaeologists and historians debate its location to this day, with candidates in northern Kyushu and the Kinai region of central Honshu. The uncertainty is fitting. This is a world still half in shadow, where evidence is partial and interpretation cautious. What seems clear is that Himiko did not rule alone in a modern sense. Her authority likely rested on a confederation of clans, each retaining local control while recognizing her ritual supremacy. Such a structure reflects the political reality of the time. Alliances were fragile, loyalty was negotiated, and power depended as much on belief as on force. Diplomacy plays a central role in this period. Himiko is recorded as sending envoys to the Chinese court of Wei in 239 CE, bearing tribute and requesting recognition. In return, she receives gifts, bronze mirrors, ceremonial items, and the title Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei. These objects and titles are not merely symbolic. They legitimize her authority domestically, tying local rule to the prestige of a powerful foreign empire. The mirrors, in particular, matter. In East Asia, mirrors are associated with power, clarity, and the ability to reflect truth. In later Japanese tradition, the mirror becomes one of the imperial regalia. Here, centuries earlier, it already carries deep significance. The exchange reveals a growing awareness of the wider world. Japan is no longer only inward-looking. Its leaders understand that authority can be strengthened through recognition beyond the islands. At the same time, China benefits by stabilizing its periphery through diplomatic ties rather than conquest. Within Japan, spiritual belief continues to underpin political order. Ritual sites, burial practices, and sacred landscapes remain central to community life. Leadership is justified through lineage and connection to the unseen. The boundary between religion and politics does not yet exist. To rule is to mediate between humans and forces beyond them. Himiko's death, recorded around 248 CE, is followed by renewed unrest. The Chronicles note conflict and upheaval, suggesting that her authority was personal and difficult to replace. A younger female relative is said to have succeeded her, restoring order once again. The pattern reinforces the idea that sacred legitimacy, rather than institutional structure, holds these early polities together. Archaeologically, this era shows increasing complexity. Large settlements appear. Burial mounds grow more prominent, though not yet monumental. Imported goods from the continent become more common. Iron tools and weapons spread further. The pace of change accelerates. Yet this is still a world without a centralized state. Clans compete and cooperate. Alliances shift with marriage, ritual, and necessity. Power remains rooted in place and kinship. Written law does not exist. Memory and precedent guide decisions. If you imagine standing at a ritual gathering in this period, the atmosphere is charged but restrained. Offerings are made. Words are spoken carefully. Authority is present, but it is not enforced through standing armies or codified law. It rests on trust, fear of the unseen, and shared belief in order. Himiko's legacy is not a dynasty, but a precedent. She demonstrates that large-scale authority is possible, that disparate communities can be bound together under a single, sacred figure. She also marks the moment when Japan becomes visible to history beyond itself. After her, the forces she helped stabilize do not disappear. They continue to grow, to compete, to seek permanence. Clans accumulate land and followers. Ritual authority begins to merge with military power. Burial practices expand in scale and ambition. The quiet world of small chiefdoms is moving towards something more enduring. Soon, power will no longer be expressed primarily through words spoken to spirits or titles granted from afar, but through earth itself shaped, piled, and transformed into monuments meant to last longer than any ruler's life. And across the plains and valleys of the islands, the ground is already being prepared for tombs that will redefine how authority is seen, remembered, and feared. This is the Kofun period, beginning around the 3rd century CE and lasting into the early 7th century. Its name comes from the distinctive tomb mounds, kofun, that dominate the landscape. Some are small and simple, others are enormous, keyhole-shaped structures that stretch hundreds of meters, rising like islands of earth above the plains. These mounds are more than graves. They are expressions of authority, a way for leaders to claim permanence, even as life remains fleeting. The keyhole-shaped kofun are particularly striking. Seen from above, they combine a circular rear mound with a rectangular front platform. Archaeologists believe this shape is symbolic, though the meaning is not fully known. Some suggest the circular section represents heaven or the sacred, while the rectangular portion corresponds to the earthly world. Whatever the intent, the form signals sophistication in planning, labor organization, and aesthetic vision. Building such a mound requires thousands of people working over months, sometimes years. Labor is coordinated, sustained, and disciplined. Earth is moved in baskets or dragged in wooden sledges. Stones are laid along edges. Ditches are dug to define boundaries. The very act of construction reinforces social hierarchy. Some oversee, some toil, some provide resources. Authority becomes performative, manifest in labor as well as lineage. Within these mounds, elite individuals are interred with objects that demonstrate their status and the reach of their connections. Bronze mirrors, iron weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial items are common. The grave goods are not merely personal possessions, they are statements. They indicate control over wealth, trade, and ritual knowledge. Some items come from distant regions, showing that long-distance exchange continues to shape the archipelago. Clay figures known as haniwa stand on and around these tombs. Cylindrical or human-shaped, they once may have represented attendants, guardians, or symbols of power. Their placement is deliberate, facing outward, encircling the mound, observing boundaries. They mark the space as sacred, signaling that the authority contained within the mound extends beyond the living. They are silent witnesses, enduring where flesh and blood cannot. The rise of the Yamato clan coincides with this monumental display. Based in the Kinai region, near modern Nara and Asuka, the Yamato family gradually consolidates influence over neighboring clans. Their leaders gain authority through both ritual and military means. Kofun associated with Yamato elites are among the largest, emphasizing their claim to supremacy. By projecting power into the landscape itself, they make a statement. Leadership is not temporary, nor purely personal. It is institutional, hereditary, and territorial. Despite these advances, Yamato authority is not absolute. Other regional powers continue to exist, and alliances are fragile. Military capability remains local, though improved. Iron weapons become more common, enhancing both hunting and warfare. Cavalry emerges as an important tool, giving some clans mobility and advantage. Yet much of power is ceremonial, rooted in perception and belief as much as in coercion. The political landscape is mirrored in the material one. Kofun are often clustered in regions with agricultural productivity or strategic importance. Their size and richness vary, reflecting local resources and influence. Even minor mounds convey social distinction, reinforcing hierarchy within communities. The landscape itself becomes a record of political negotiation and assertion. Religious practice remains intertwined with authority. Sacred sites, ritual implements, and offerings continue to define legitimacy. Leaders act as mediators between humans and unseen forces, a role increasingly formalized as part of the Yamato strategy. Ritual and tomb construction merge to reinforce both political and spiritual supremacy. At the same time, continuity with earlier traditions is evident. The Jōmon respect for the landscape, the attention to craft, and the integration of everyday life with ritual persist. The difference is scale. The Kofun period magnifies these practices, transforming personal or local gestures into statements of state power. The keyhole mounds, in particular, reflect careful engineering and symbolic thinking. Soil must be compacted properly. Slopes must be graded. Surrounding ditches sometimes function as both markers and drainage. Water management is integrated. These are not casual constructions. They are deliberate, carefully planned, and maintained. The act of building is as much about reinforcing social cohesion as it is about honoring the dead. If you were to walk across one of these ancient landscapes, the presence of the mounds is immediate. Even when centuries have passed, the scale is imposing. Standing at the base of a large mound, you can almost sense the effort required to move tons of earth without modern tools. The Haniwa gaze silently across the plain. The landscape itself asserts hierarchy before you even know the name of the person buried within. Kofun are not uniform. Some contain multiple burials, others a single elite individual. Grave goods differ in quantity and quality, yet the message is consistent. Leadership matters. It outlives the individual. It is visible, durable, and inescapable. The consolidation of power also brings the beginnings of more complex governance. Regional chiefs administer tribute, manage resources, and organize labor. Yamato elites gradually extend influence over peripheral regions, not through conquest alone, but by forming alliances, arranging marriages, and controlling ritual authority. Authority begins to be institutionalized, laying groundwork for a future centralized state. Cultural practices reflect these political realities. Burial rituals become more formalized. Ceremonial practices are standardized. Symbols of power, mirrors, swords, armor are repeated across regions. Identity and status are communicated visually, materially, and ritually. This is an era in which authority becomes tangible, observable, and deeply entrenched in everyday life. Yet life beyond the mounds continues in continuity with the past. Farming, hunting, and fishing remain the backbone of subsistence. Small villages dot the plains. Forests are still sources of food and fuel. Waterways provide transportation and fish. The rhythm of the seasons still shapes daily life, even under the shadow of monumental authority. Power has grown, but the land itself remains constant, demanding respect and adaptation. Social tension grows alongside hierarchy. Surplus production allows some to accumulate wealth, while others remain dependent. Fortified villages and defensive structures appear more frequently, reflecting both competition and the need for security. Conflict is not yet constant war, but it is increasingly organized and politically significant. Leadership now requires both ritual legitimacy and practical management, combining influence over the spiritual and material world. The kofun period also marks the beginning of written awareness beyond the islands. Chinese historians continue to record encounters with Wa polities. Trade networks, political alliances, and the movement of goods are observed. The islands are no longer isolated. They exist within a larger East Asian context. Recognition by distant courts reinforces local authority, just as it did during the reign of Himiko, but now it is paired with monumental expressions on home soil. Through all of this, the mounds endure. They are the first large-scale, permanent marks of human authority in Japan. Unlike temporary settlements or seasonal camps, they are designed to last centuries. Earth and clay record hierarchy, belief, and social organization. The kofun themselves become anchors in the cultural landscape, guiding memory and shaping perception long after the bodies beneath have returned to dust. If you imagine approaching one of these mounds at sunrise, the effect is subtle but profound. Morning light glances off the rounded surfaces, casting long shadows across the plain. Haniwa figures stand in silent formation. Birds and wind interact with the structures as though acknowledging their presence. There is a weight to the landscape now, a reminder that human ambition can shape not only society, but the earth itself. The largest kofun, such as Daisen Kofun in Sakai, reach lengths of several hundred meters, dwarfing any contemporary building. The scale communicates power without words. It speaks through magnitude, labor, and permanence. These mounds are statements that echo across generations, reminding all who live nearby that authority can outlast life, memory, and even time itself. At the same time, these developments are not isolated from the human experience. Ordinary people, farmers, laborers, craftspeople interact daily with these displays of power. They participate in construction, observe rituals, and carry on their own lives within the framework of elite authority. The kofun are monumental, yes, but they also exist within the context of a lived, local world. Through earth and clay, Japan begins to inscribe a new concept of legacy. Authority is no longer ephemeral. It is layered, material, and performative. Leadership is communicated not only through words, ritual, or personal prowess, but through labor and landscape, visible to generations yet unborn. As the kofun period matures, power continues to centralize. Yamato leaders consolidate influence, integrating ritual, military, and economic authority. This sets the stage for further transformations in governance, law, and society. By embedding power in both landscape and practice, they lay the foundation for the Japanese state, which will fully emerge in the centuries to follow. And as the earth itself carries these statements of authority, human ambition begins to intertwine with permanence, creating a world where leadership can survive beyond the limits of life, signaling to the future that someone, somewhere, was here and mattered enough to shape the ground beneath them. By the mid-6th century, Japan enters the Asuka period, a time named after the region where rulers first consolidate power near present-day Nara. This is a period of rapid cultural and political change. Unlike the slow generational shifts of Jōmon and Yayoi life, or the gradual monumentalization of the kofun, Asuka transformation arrives with books, images, and foreign teachers. The islands are no longer isolated in practice or imagination. One of the most significant arrivals is Buddhism, transmitted through Korea and China. Statues, texts, and ritual practices accompany merchants, envoys, and monks across the sea. Unlike local religious practice, which focused on ancestral spirits and the natural world, Buddhism introduces new ideas, concepts of morality, impermanence, and the possibility of salvation through study, reflection, and ritual. Its teachings also imply a society that can be organized around ethical and spiritual principles, rather than simply lineage or force. The introduction of Buddhism is not universally welcomed. Clans who control ritual and ancestral authority perceive it as a threat to their influence. The Soga clan, proponents of the new faith, support its adoption, while the Mononobe clan resists, arguing that ancestral spirits and native kami must not be neglected. Conflict emerges, though rarely purely violent. Diplomacy, intrigue, and ceremonial assertion play equal roles. Religion is deeply intertwined with politics. In the midst of this, one figure stands central: Prince Shotoku, a regent and reformer whose vision of governance is revolutionary. He champions Buddhism not merely as faith but as a framework for statecraft. Shotoku sees the potential for a society guided by principles and codified rules. He is credited with authoring the 17-article Constitution, a brief text that outlines the ethical duties of officials, the importance of harmony, and the need to respect Buddhism and Confucian teachings. Though short and abstract by modern standards, the document represents one of the first attempts in Japan to articulate governance as a system rather than a matter of personal authority. The 17-article Constitution emphasizes moral leadership, collective responsibility, and order. Officials are expected to act according to principles, not merely inherit power. Decisions should be guided by reason and ritual propriety. While the enforcement of such ideals is inconsistent, the text signals a profound shift. Leadership is no longer justified solely by birth or physical control. It can be rationalized, codified, and transmitted through instruction. Alongside these intellectual reforms, the Asuka period sees practical transformations in administration. Landholding and taxation are restructured under the Taika reforms of 645 CE. The reforms seek to centralize authority under the imperial court, standardize laws, and distribute land in ways that prevent excessive local consolidation of power. They lay the groundwork for the Ritsuryo system, a codified legal and administrative framework that will endure for centuries. The state begins to exist as an idea, as well as a physical presence in temples, roads, and courts. Buddhism reinforces these developments. Monks become advisors and administrators, teaching literacy, record-keeping, and ritual discipline. Temples are centers of learning and social organization. Sacred statues and architecture communicate the power of the state and the sanctity of governance. The emperor and court adopt Buddhist symbolism to legitimize authority, linking spiritual merit to political order. In effect, belief and law coalesce. The material evidence of this period underscores the transformations. Temple complexes rise near Asuka, often built with imported techniques and materials. Bronze statues of the Buddha appear, carefully crafted, reflecting both artistry and devotion. Sutras, sometimes carved in stone, preserve teachings and provide models of writing, literacy, and codified thought. Every new object is a manifestation of cultural exchange, technical skill, and political strategy. Social hierarchy continues to intensify. Officials, scholars, and clerics gain authority through knowledge and position. Military power is less visible than in earlier periods of clan conflict, but it remains embedded in society through control of land and tribute. The distinction between ordinary people, local leaders, and state functionaries becomes more formalized. These changes create a framework for governance that extends beyond individual personalities. At the same time, life outside the elite centers persists in familiar rhythms. Farmers tend rice fields, as in Yayoi and kofun times. Villagers continue to manage seasonal labor. Forests provide resources. Rivers and coasts remain essential for food and transportation. But the reach of centralized policy increasingly touches these communities. Taxation, labor obligations, and ritual participation link ordinary life to the expanding state apparatus. Prince Shotoku's influence exemplifies the merging of ethics, religion, and administration. He establishes protocols for courtly behavior, promotes literacy among officials, and encourages the study of Chinese classics. Knowledge is no longer incidental, it becomes a tool of governance. The message is clear: a state can be constructed through thought, ritual, and institutional design. Conflict does not disappear entirely. Clan rivalries remain a constant undercurrent. The tension between conservative forces and reformers shapes the pace of change. Yet the focus of power is shifting from personal dominance to systems, from physical monuments to codified principles, from ephemeral prestige to enduring structure. The state begins to exist conceptually, even before it reaches full practical control. Buddhism also transforms everyday life. Rituals offer guidance for morality, death, and community cohesion. Monks act as intermediaries, teachers, and record keepers. The presence of sacred spaces, statues, and texts changes how people understand their place in the world. The spiritual and political realms reinforce each other, giving authority both legitimacy and visibility. Literacy becomes increasingly important. The adoption of Chinese characters allows the court to preserve records, communicate with neighboring powers, and codify law. Writing is no longer only a tool for ritual, it is a means of governance. Texts transmit instruction across time and distance, making administration more consistent and centralized. If you could observe an Asuka village, the contrast with earlier periods would be subtle but perceptible. Rice fields are organized according to official decrees. Local leaders participate in ritual and tribute systems. Envoys from distant polities occasionally visit, bringing gifts or instruction. The rhythms of ordinary life continue planting, harvesting, and seasonal ceremonies, but they now exist within a wider framework of state authority and emerging ideology. Architecture reflects this integration. Palaces are constructed with imported techniques, combining function, symbolism, and authority. Temples, often adjacent to administrative centers, symbolize the interdependence of faith and power. Statues of the Buddha, meticulously cast and polished, demonstrate skill, devotion, and political intent. Every visual element communicates hierarchy and legitimacy. The Asuka period is also a time of experimentation. The state is being designed as much as it is inherited. Officials test methods of administration, land management, and ritual organization. Successes are codified, failures are recorded and adjusted. The process of governance becomes iterative, emphasizing planning, foresight, and documentation concepts that had not guided leadership in earlier centuries. In effect, Japan is learning to govern through thought as well as action. And yet, the human element remains central. Ambition, loyalty, rivalry, and belief continue to shape outcomes. The success of reforms depends on persuasion, personal authority, and interpretation. Systems are only as strong as the people who enact them. As governance becomes more abstract, the need for capable, educated, and ethical officials grows. By the end of the Asuka period, the foundations of the Japanese state are firmly in place. Centralized authority, codified laws, Buddhism, literacy, and ritual legitimacy converge to form a society capable of sustaining a complex hierarchy. Authority is no longer merely performed, it is conceptualized. It exists on paper, in temples, in ceremonial spaces, and in the minds of people trained to uphold it. This transformation reshapes not just politics but identity. The islands are increasingly unified under an emerging idea of Japan. Local differences remain, but the vision of a coherent, governed polity provides a framework for collective understanding. People begin to perceive themselves as part of a structured society linked to rulers who claim legitimacy both spiritual and legal. If you stand near one of the early Asuka temples today, or imagine it in its time, you would sense a deliberate stillness. The building is not only functional, it embodies order, stability, and authority. Statues watch over visitors, sutras line shelves or stone surfaces. Every element reinforces a message. Governance is more than coercion. It can be structured, codified, and guided by thought. Through these innovations, Japan begins to write its own rules, literally and figuratively. Leadership is no longer inherited solely by blood or enforced solely by force. Instead, it combines moral principle, spiritual sanction, administrative competence, and codified law. The nation becomes, in essence, a project of design. And as the sun sets over Asuka, the gentle reflection of light on polished bronze and carved wood mirrors the quiet work of a society constructing its future. The foundations laid here, faith, literacy, law, and administration, will endure for centuries. They mark a turning point, the moment when Japan begins to govern itself not just by tradition or force, but through ideas consciously implemented, recorded, and remembered. The age of ritual, mound, and clan gradually gives way to capitals, chronicles, and statecraft, setting the stage for the first permanent seats of government, the creation of enduring institutions, and a society increasingly conscious of its own continuity. And somewhere in the rhythm of courtly life, in the quiet movement of monks, scribes, and officials, the next chapter of Japanese history quietly waits to be written. By the early 8th century, the court moves toward permanence, establishing Nara as the first official, long-term capital. Unlike previous temporary or seasonal centers of power, Nara is planned and monumental, a deliberate expression of authority through architecture, urban design, and ritual. Wide streets run in a grid, flanked by administrative buildings, temples, and residences for officials. Palaces occupy the center, symbolizing the concentration of political and spiritual power. The very layout conveys hierarchy, the emperor and court at the heart, citizens and clergy radiating outward. The establishment of a permanent capital reflects the maturation of the Ritsuryo system, which codified law, taxation, and administration. Nara is both a practical center and a symbol. Its permanence communicates that governance is not transient. Authority, once ephemeral in the Jōmon world, or ritual based in Asuka, now occupies space deliberately and visibly. Stone markers, wooden buildings, and carefully maintained roads announce presence and control. Religious life intertwines with governance more visibly than ever. Buddhism, now firmly established, is central to the capital's identity. Massive temple complexes rise. Todaiji, with its monumental Great Buddha, exemplifies the fusion of faith, art, and state authority. The statue itself, cast in bronze and gilded with gold, dominates the courtyard, an awe-inspiring symbol of spiritual and political legitimacy. Monks and nuns serve both religious and administrative functions, recording events, educating scribes, and maintaining ritual order. The city becomes a stage upon which faith legitimizes power. Alongside architecture, literacy begins to shape Japan's self-perception. The court commissions histories, resulting in works that endure as foundational texts, the Kojiki records of ancient matters, 712, and the Nihon Shoki Chronicles of Japan, 720. These texts blend myth, legend, and early historical events, preserving both memory and authority. They recount creation, the deeds of gods and early rulers, and the genealogy of emperors, binding spiritual and political continuity. These chronicles are more than stories. They are instruments of governance. They define the past in ways that support current authority. Lineages are traced meticulously. Divine sanction is woven into political claims. By recording history, the court frames legitimacy and memory as inseparable. Leaders are not only rulers of the present, they are heirs to sacred precedent. Nara's rise also consolidates economic and social systems. Roads, canals, and markets facilitate trade and taxation. Agricultural produce flows into the city, sustaining officials, artisans, and religious institutions. Villages across the islands are integrated into a larger network of obligation and service. The state becomes visible not only in stone and wood, but in the daily lives of ordinary people. Cultural life flourishes under these conditions. Crafts such as bronze casting, lacquer work, and textiles reach new heights of sophistication. Art and architecture communicate hierarchy and ideology. Ceremonial events, festivals, and processions reinforce social cohesion, reminding citizens of their roles within a structured society. Even the rhythm of time becomes codified, with calendar systems, seasonal observances, and ritual schedules binding society together. The permanence of Nara contrasts sharply with the transient camps and seasonal villages of earlier periods. Whereas in Jōmon times memory was tied to place and practice without inscription, and in the kofun era, earth itself commemorated authority, Nara combines both, physical presence with written record. Authority now exists in multiple forms, visible, enduring, and documented. Despite centralization, regional variation persists. Local leaders continue to manage villages, enforce law, and maintain rituals. Communication between Nara and distant provinces relies on a growing bureaucracy. Officials travel, record, and report, while local populations respond to taxation, conscription, and ceremonial requirements. The state extends its reach through a combination of record-keeping, ritual, and infrastructure. Buddhism's influence is inseparable from these developments. Monks advise rulers, maintain archives, and educate scribes. Temples are not merely spiritual spaces, they are centers of knowledge and administration. Artistic production, religious ritual, and political authority converge, reinforcing the centrality of the capital in both practical and symbolic terms. The creation of written histories also has philosophical implications. Memory, once preserved orally and locally, now becomes centralized and controlled. The past is no longer diffuse or subjective. It can be consulted, referenced, and interpreted according to the needs of governance. Authority claims continuity not only through action or ritual, but through narrative. Leaders are embedded in a story that spans centuries. If you imagine walking through Nara in its early years, the experience is both monumental and intimate. Streets are wide, yet filled with the sound of officials, monks, and citizens going about daily tasks. The scent of incense rises from temples. Bronze gleams in the sunlight. Every structure, from palace to pagoda, communicates hierarchy, purpose, and permanence. Life continues at the local level. Markets bustle, farmers deliver grain, and children play, but all within a larger framework that is increasingly structured, disciplined, and recorded. This period also sees experimentation with legal and administrative codification. Officials adapt Chinese models to Japanese conditions, establishing laws and offices that balance local autonomy with central authority. Land allocation, taxation, and military obligations are formalized. Literacy and record-keeping allow these policies to be enforced consistently. The state is no longer ephemeral. It has a blueprint, a memory, and a presence in both space and text. Yet Nara is not without tension. Regional leaders sometimes resist central authority. Religious factions vie for influence. Resources are limited, and population pressures occasionally spark disputes. The court must balance ritual, bureaucracy, and enforcement, demonstrating that permanence alone does not guarantee harmony. Stability is negotiated, maintained, and sometimes contested. Even so, the consolidation of capitals, chronicles, and bureaucracy marks a turning point. The island's rulers now understand that authority can be projected through infrastructure, material culture, and narrative. Governance is as much about planning and writing as it is about ritual or coercion. The state exists not only in the present, but as a concept anchored to time, space, and memory. In parallel, artistic and literary culture flourishes. Temples and palaces are decorated with sculpture, painting, and intricate woodwork. Religious texts are copied meticulously. Poetry, ritual, and performance intertwine with governance, reflecting both aesthetic sensibilities and political intention. The capital itself becomes a repository of culture, knowledge, and ideology. The people of Nara, from officials to artisans, are participants in a carefully designed society. Labor, literacy, and ritual are coordinated. Obedience and creativity are both harnessed to sustain authority. Even everyday tasks, from irrigation to temple maintenance, carry significance within the broader structure. Life is no longer entirely local or ephemeral. It is integrated into a system with historical consciousness and spatial permanence. By the end of the Nara period, Japan has taken a decisive step towards self-awareness as a nation. Its first permanent capital demonstrates the possibility of enduring authority. Its chronicles establish memory as a tool of governance. Its temples and statues materialize ideology. And its administrative system, increasingly codified and bureaucratized, integrates people and land into a coherent framework. Through stone, wood, and ink, the islands are no longer just inhabited, they are ordered, recorded, and conceptualized. Authority extends beyond ritual. beyond personal power, and begins to outlast the individuals who wield it. Memory, labor, and narrative converge to create a society that not only governs, but remembers itself. And as the city rises, its streets echoing with footsteps and prayers, its temples gleaming in the sun, and its scribes copying histories with careful hands, Japan begins to see itself not merely as a collection of clans and villages, but as a world with its own past, present, and future, ready to be chronicled, reflected upon, and carried forward into the centuries yet to come. In 794 CE, the imperial court moves east to Heian, present-day Kyoto, establishing a capital designed not only for administration, but for beauty, ritual, and expression. Unlike Nara's monumental and rigid streets, Heian is conceived with aesthetic order in mind. Wide avenues framed by carefully aligned residences, canals that shimmer in sunlight, and gardens that mirror the seasons. The city embodies a philosophy that governance and elegance can coexist, and that refinement itself is a measure of authority. At the heart of this society is the aristocracy, particularly the Fujiwara clan. Through strategic marriages, they weave themselves into the imperial family, consolidating power quietly yet effectively. Their influence is exercised through courtly ceremony, patronage, and control of succession, rather than through armies or mounds of earth. Power becomes invisible in some ways, revealed in posture, etiquette, and the distribution of honor. Life at court is highly ritualized. Clothing, speech, and gesture communicate status as precisely as law once did. Women of the court, in particular, wield influence through literary skill, artistry, and social networking. The movement of robes, the choice of colors, even the arrangement of hair can mark rank, taste, and intention. The visual language of elegance is inseparable from political authority. Literature flourishes in this environment. Writing in kana, a script adapted to Japanese sounds, allows expression beyond the rigid Chinese characters of previous centuries. Diaries, poetry, and fiction become vehicles of influence. The courtly elite record daily life, emotions, and social commentary with meticulous care. Works such as The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu and The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon reflect this interplay of art and power, blending observation, imagination, and subtle assertion of authority. In these texts, words serve multiple purposes. They entertain, document, and manipulate. Letters can smooth conflicts, praise allies, or signal dissent without confrontation. Poetry can convey complex emotion or reinforce social hierarchies. In a world where the emperor's presence is often ceremonial, the skillful use of language becomes a form of governance. Words, in effect, are as potent as decrees. Silence, too, is a tool. Courtiers learn to observe, to listen, and to communicate meaning without speech. A pause, a glance, a measured bow, these can indicate favor or disapproval, inclusion or exclusion. In a culture where appearance and perception are paramount, restraint itself is a form of power. The physical environment of Heian reinforces these principles. Residences are open to light and air, with sliding screens that create private and public spaces simultaneously. Gardens are designed for contemplation and seasonal display. Canals carry boats and reflect the sky, integrating transportation, beauty, and symbolism. Movement through these spaces requires attention to detail, posture, and ritual, blending daily life with aesthetic principle. Education and literacy define access to influence. Reading and writing are not merely functional, they are markers of refinement. Nobles study poetry, calligraphy, and history as part of their preparation for court life. Knowledge of ritual, etiquette, and literature enables subtle negotiation, reputation management, and social advancement. Authority is no longer only inherited, it is performed and recognized through skill. The imperial court, while central, is not isolated from broader society. Provincial officials, religious figures, and artisans contribute to the circulation of goods, knowledge, and ideas. Luxury objects, textiles, and craft items flow along trade networks, connecting the capital with distant provinces. Yet the court mediates these flows, ensuring that aesthetic and social standards reflect central authority. Taste itself becomes a mechanism of governance. Religion continues to shape life. Though differently from Asuka or Nara, Buddhism, now long established, emphasizes ritual, meditation, and aesthetics. Temples are not only places of worship but centers of art, education, and political presence. Shinto rituals coexist alongside Buddhist practice, linking imperial legitimacy to both indigenous and imported beliefs. The sacred is woven into everyday movement, architecture, and ceremony. Even daily routines carry weight. Meals, clothing, and leisure are occasions for display and observation. Courtiers cultivate an awareness of subtle social cues: how to enter a room, how to receive guests, how to compose a poem for an ally or rival. Every act is meaningful, every omission significant. Life is orchestrated as a performance, and the audience is always present. The aesthetic principles of Heian culture are not purely ornamental. They communicate hierarchy, stabilize social order, and mediate conflict. Elegance can diffuse tension, signal alignment, or assert superiority. In a court where armies rarely gather and mounds are relics of the past, the mastery of presence and refinement becomes the most effective form of authority. Art and literature also preserve memory. Diaries, poetry collections, and illustrated manuscripts document events, seasons, and personalities. They extend authority into the future by shaping perception of the past. Leaders are remembered not only for actions but for their cultivated persona, their aesthetic judgment, and their social influence. Legacy is constructed through observation, documentation, and taste as much as through force or law. Yet the world of courtly refinement exists alongside practical realities. Provincial administration, rice collection, and military obligations continue. Samurai are emerging as a distinct class, beginning as provincial enforcers and guards. Their rise is gradual and initially peripheral to the court, but the structures established in Heian society, hierarchy, ritual, and record-keeping will allow their later integration into centralized power. If you imagine wandering the streets of Heian-kyo, you would notice the subtle signals everywhere. A noblewoman's flowing sleeves brush the polished wood floors. A carefully chosen poem is recited at a garden pavilion. Incense curls through the air, mixing with the scent of blossoms and polished wood. The atmosphere is deliberate, choreographed, and alive with meaning. Authority is both everywhere and elusive, observed in action and absence alike. Seasonality remains central to life and literature. Cherry blossoms, autumn leaves, and snow provide recurring motifs that link temporal cycles to aesthetic judgment. Celebrations, processions, and quiet moments in gardens are all infused with layered significance. Observing nature, composing verse, and performing ritual are not leisure alone. They are exercises in authority, refinement, and social cohesion. Gender roles shape participation in these processes. While men dominate formal political positions, women exert influence through literature, household management, and courtly networking. Their writings, diaries, essays, and poetry record social norms, critique leadership, and establish personal authority. In a society where visibility is both constrained and codified, influence is subtle but potent. Artisans, scribes, and scholars are also essential. Their work enables the court to sustain aesthetic and bureaucratic authority. Calligraphy, painting, lacquerwork, and textile production are all intertwined with governance. Objects carry messages. A scroll indicates taste. A garment reflects status. A ritual implement conveys legitimacy. Material culture becomes a language of power as intricate and disciplined as spoken words. Conflict exists quietly. Rivalries over influence, marriage, or succession are expressed through performance, correspondence, and alliances. Open warfare is rare within the capital, but looms in the provinces. The mechanisms of subtle social negotiation allow the court to maintain stability even as tensions simmer beneath surfaces. In this way, silence is as instructive as speech. Restraint communicates as clearly as assertion. Education, literacy, and ritual continue to define hierarchy. Knowledge of classical texts, mastery of poetry, and fluency in social codes are prerequisites for advancement. Success depends on observation, calculation, and timing. Authority is exercised through recognition, perception, and refinement. Power is enacted in art as much as in administration. By the end of the early Heian period, Japan has developed a society in which culture, ritual, and aesthetic mastery constitute central instruments of governance. Authority is embedded in literature, movement, architecture, and ceremonial behavior. Memory is preserved in diaries and poetry, and influence is communicated through subtle gestures as effectively as through decrees. In Heian-kyo, the world itself seems to participate in governance. Canals reflect light and movement. Gardens frame vistas and direct attention. Screens divide space and hint at unseen presence. Even silence has rhythm, shaping perception and behavior. Every element, from stone to ink to gesture, reinforces hierarchy, expectation, and aesthetic judgment. And as the sun rises and sets over the palaces, temples, and gardens, the court of Heian-kyo moves through its rituals, poetry, and observation, creating a society where beauty becomes power, words become instruments of influence, and silence carries authority across space and time, preparing the islands for the next transformation, when the forces of ambition, land, and military might will again rise to reshape the nation. Beyond the palaces and gardens of Heian-kyo, the provinces pulse with different life, a life shaped not by courtly etiquette, but by land, resources, and the demands of survival. By the late 10th century, the foundations of aristocratic power are increasingly fragile. The Fujiwara clan, once supreme through marriage alliances and bureaucratic influence, finds itself contending with structural limitations. Vast estates, known as showan, begin to accumulate under private control, exempt from central taxation and oversight. Local managers oversee rice fields, forests, and labor, often independently of the court. Authority in these regions grows more practical than ceremonial, and influence is measured less in poetry and more in the ability to mobilize men, resources, and defenses. The emergence of the showan system marks a fundamental shift. Where the court in Heian-kyo exercised control through law, ritual, and aesthetic judgment, local lords now assert power through possession, protection, and management of land. The aristocracy's reach is limited by geography and administration. In distant provinces, governors, warriors, and landholders consolidate authority in ways that reflect both ambition and necessity. It is within this context that the samurai begin to emerge, not yet a distinct class in the way they will be in later centuries, but a growing force of mounted warriors, skilled in archery and swordsmanship, responsible for maintaining order, protecting estates, and projecting influence. They serve local lords, but their loyalty is often flexible, based on personal relationships, patronage, and opportunity. Mobility and martial skill become new currencies of power. Clans such as the Taira and Minamoto rise to prominence during this period, balancing service to the court with independent ambitions. The Taira consolidate influence in western Honshu and Kyushu, while the Minamoto gain footholds in the eastern provinces. Their activities combine administration, military readiness, and strategic alliances. The court may grant official titles, but real authority increasingly rests on land, men, and strategic vision. Tensions occasionally erupt into violence, though often preceded by negotiation, marriage alliances, and diplomacy. Still, the capacity for force becomes decisive. Private armies patrol roads and rivers. Fortified manors appear in strategic locations. Mounted warriors can project power quickly across terrain that once limited political reach. The rhythm of the islands begins to include hoofbeats alongside the cadence of poetry. The late Heian period is punctuated by a series of conflicts that reveal the fragility of courtly authority. Two notable disturbances, the Hogan Rebellion, 1156, and the Heiji Rebellion, 1160, reflect the competition between rival factions, aristocratic, provincial, and military. Both conflicts are brief yet consequential. They demonstrate that ceremonial titles alone cannot guarantee power, and that military organization and loyalty are becoming decisive in determining outcomes. The Hogan rebellion begins with a dispute over succession. Emperor Go-Shirakawa and retired Emperor Sutoku become focal points for rival aristocratic and military interests. The Taira and Minamoto clans align on opposing sides, bringing their forces into play. Battles are fought along rivers and roads, in villages and fortifications, often with devastating local impact. The court's authority is challenged not by a single rival, but by a network of provincial forces, increasingly capable of enforcing claims independently. The Heiji Rebellion, only a few years later, similarly centers on succession and influence, but it also highlights the growing tactical skill of warrior clans. The Minamoto and Taira once again oppose each other, engaging in night raids, sieges, and strategic occupation of the capital. These uprisings demonstrate the transformation of political power. The authority of the emperor and court remains symbolically central, but real control now hinges on martial capacity and the ability to marshal loyalty. Amid these conflicts, the role of the samurai evolves. They are not merely soldiers, they are administrators, negotiators, and protectors of estates. Their authority derives from personal skill, reputation, and loyalty networks. They navigate between ceremonial obligation and practical necessity, exercising judgment in matters of life, death, and land. This flexibility distinguishes them from earlier elites, whose influence depended largely on ritual, lineage, or bureaucratic position. The culmination of these trends occurs in the Genpei War, 1180-1185, a decisive conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans. It is a nationwide struggle, encompassing battles on land and sea, sieges of fortresses, and campaigns that stretch from the western provinces to the capital region. The war is both military and symbolic. It signals the end of an era in which courtly culture dominated and the beginning of a society where military organization and regional control dictate authority. The war reaches its climax at the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, a naval confrontation in the narrow strait of Shimonoseki. Minamoto forces engage the Taira in a decisive struggle that involves archery, boarding actions, and careful navigation of tides and currents. Victory belongs to Minamoto no Yoritomo's allies, effectively extinguishing Taira dominance and reshaping the political landscape. The court remains, but its influence is diminished. The islands now recognize that real power is exercised by those who can wield force and organize loyalty. Yoritomo consolidates authority in Kamakura, establishing the first shogunate and inaugurating a system in which military leadership becomes central to governance. While the emperor remains a symbolic figurehead, the shogun exercises practical control over land, military resources, and administration. This transition reflects a profound shift in the nature of authority. It is no longer primarily ceremonial, literary, or aesthetic, but functional, enforceable, and rooted in martial capacity. The rise of the samurai also transforms society in subtle ways. Honor, loyalty, and discipline become central values. Martial skill is taught and refined. Networks of patronage and obligation structure relationships. Land management is inseparable from military readiness. Even daily life, from rice production to local governance, is informed by the need for security and the capacity for force. The rhythm of the islands is now measured not only in seasons or festivals, but in readiness for conflict and defense. These changes do not erase the legacy of earlier periods. Literature, ritual, and aesthetic refinement continue to influence the court, temples, and provincial culture. Poetic forms survive, courtly etiquette is maintained, and religious practice continues alongside martial activity. But the balance has shifted. The cadence of life increasingly includes the noise of preparation, the vigilance of armed men, and the imperatives of survival and dominance. If you were to observe a provincial estate in this period, you would see fortified residences, guards patrolling boundaries, and mounted warriors exercising skill with bow and sword. You would hear the faint clatter of hooves across fields, and the careful instructions of estate managers coordinating labor and harvest. Ordinary villagers maintain their work, but within a system that is enforced by martial authority. The ideals of courtly elegance are distant, Practical necessity dictates daily behavior. At the same time, alliances and rivalries are dynamic. Marriage, inheritance, and negotiation remain vital tools. Samurai navigate a complex social landscape where loyalty is personal, yet essential. Authority is asserted and maintained through both action and reputation. Successful warriors gain influence not only through victory, but through strategic alliances and management of land and resources. The legacy of this period endures in multiple ways. The shogunate establishes a framework for military governance that will shape Japan for centuries. The samurai ethos, discipline, loyalty, and martial skill becomes a central social and cultural value. Regional estates and networks of obligation create patterns of administration that persist long after the battles have ended. And the court, while diminished in practical power, continues to influence culture, ritual, and legitimacy, ensuring continuity alongside transformation. Amid the upheaval, human experience remains constant. Families tend fields, craftsmen shape tools, and local communities navigate the tension between authority and autonomy. Yet the very soundscape of life has changed. Poetry is no longer the primary cadence. The thrum of hooves, the clang of steel, and the careful preparation of defense echo through valleys, hills, and coastal plains. History itself begins to move faster, measured in campaigns, victories, and the rise of new powers. The final moments of the Genpei War demonstrate the transformation vividly. In Dan-no-Yura, the tides, wind, and strategy converge. Boats clash, warriors fall, and the sea itself becomes a participant in history. Survivors disperse, alliances are reshaped, and new leaders emerge. The court observes, rituals continue, but the locus of decisive power has irrevocably shifted. Real authority now resides with those who command men, land, and the capacity to act decisively. Yoritomo's establishment of the Kamakura shogunate consolidates these lessons. Authority is now dual. Symbolic legitimacy resides with the emperor, yet functional governance is exercised by the shogun. This separation reflects the evolution of Japan from a court-centered society to one in which martial capability is central. Governance is practical, enforceable, and structured around land, loyalty, and military organization. Life under this emerging system is structured, disciplined, and oriented around readiness. Samurai maintain estates, manage labor, and provide protection. Provincial administration requires coordination, record-keeping, and enforcement. Daily existence blends ordinary subsistence with vigilance, creating a rhythm in which survival and loyalty define experience. Courtly culture continues to inform aesthetics, ritual, and legitimacy, but its practical authority is now secondary to military power. This era also initiates cultural developments within the samurai class itself. Codes of conduct, values of loyalty, and expectations of behavior begin to form a distinct ethos. Martial skill is complemented by literacy, administrative competence, and ritual knowledge. The combination of practicality and cultural refinement shapes the identity of the warrior class. Through these transformations, the islands experience a profound shift in the sound and pace of life. Poetry and ceremony continue, but the rhythm of hoofbeats, the preparation of arms, and the management of estates dominate the auditory and social landscape. The balance between courtly elegance and practical authority tips decisively toward the latter. By the close of the 12th century, ancient Japan, as it was known the realm of ceremonial mounds, refined courtly life, and aristocratic oversight has passed. The samurai rise to prominence, provincial power networks consolidate, and the islands are governed by a new combination of martial skill, land control, and bureaucratic administration. The narrative of history itself is transformed, moving from poetry and ritual toward action, strategy, and enforceable authority. And yet, even as horsemen ride across plains and swords gleam in the sunlight, the legacy of previous eras lingers. Written histories continue to preserve memory. Temples remain centers of faith and learning. Poetry, art, and aesthetic refinement persist alongside martial practice, reminding all that culture and power are intertwined, even as the cadence of history now echoes with hoofbeats and steel. signaling a Japan entering its next, more turbulent chapter. The landscapes shaped by early farmers, Jōmon potters, and Yayoi cultivators remain. Rice paddies stretch across lowlands much as they did 1,000 years earlier. Rivers continue to define settlement patterns, and forests still hold the quiet secrets of distant ancestors. Even when cities rise and fall, the contours of land, river, and coastline preserve traces of lives once lived. Archaeology confirms what memory alone cannot, that each generation built upon the work of those before. Stories endure in written form. Chronicles, diaries, and literary works carry the voices of past centuries into the present. Kojiki, Nihon Shoki, The Tale of Genji, and courtly diaries allow readers and listeners to encounter the values, ambitions, and rhythms of life long gone. Words transmit both history and emotion, preserving identity while shaping perception. Through them, emperors, courtiers, warriors, and common people continue to speak across time. Temples and monuments remain as silent witnesses. Kofun burial mounds, Todaiji's great Buddha, and Heian palaces, whether standing, restored, or imagined, serve as tangible connections to a past that informed the present. Even in ruins, these spaces invite reflection, a quiet acknowledgement that what once was alive still casts shadow and influence. Pilgrims, scholars, and tourists alike walk these grounds, participating in rituals of memory, whether conscious or instinctive. The transition to medieval Japan does not erase the ancient, rather, it transforms it. Samurai governance and shogunate administration build atop centuries of precedent: law, literacy, bureaucracy, and ritual. Cultural norms and artistic forms survive, integrated into new social frameworks. The elegance of Heian informs the refinement of later courts, and the spiritual traditions introduced in Asuka and Nara continue to guide practice, belief, and art. Even the distant pre-literate past persists, quietly shaping imagination. Jōmon and Yayoi settlements, their pottery, and the landscapes they occupied remind us that human life existed here long before kings, shoguns, and written chronicles. Their influence lingers in ritual, craft, and awareness of the natural world. The rhythm of the seasons, the dependence on rivers and rice, the cycles of life and death all echo in ways that feel familiar even today. History in this sense is layered rather than linear. Ancient Japan is both foundation and presence, a substrate of memory that informs identity, culture, and understanding. What was once lived struggles, triumphs, and daily routines has been transformed into narrative, artifact, and landscape. These layers allow modern observers to trace continuity, to feel a connection across time, and to recognize that the past is never entirely absent. You can almost hear the wind through the trees of old villages, or imagine the glimmer of sunlight on bronze in a distant temple. In these moments, the islands themselves seem to whisper across centuries. Life that was once immediate becomes reflection, shaping perception and understanding. Memory is not only preserved in texts or monuments, it lives in the land, in patterns of settlement, in the quiet cadence of daily life. Ancient Japan, in its mounds, temples, capitals, and literature, is a reminder that human endeavor, however transient it may seem, is rarely lost. Each generation inherits not only the land, but the structures, stories, and cultural rhythms of those who came before. Even as time progresses and societies transform, the past remains, quietly informing the present, grounding memory, and shaping imagination. And so, as you reflect on the islands across their long history from the first hunters and potters to warriors and courtiers, you recognize that what was lived has become remembered. The ancient world settles beneath later centuries like a quiet foundation, unshakable, subtle, and enduring. In this way, the story of Japan does not end, it simply becomes the soil upon which all future generations will walk, think, and live, carrying the echoes of those who came before, always present, always remembered.